Hey, it's Alex Williams here from the New Stack. I'm live from Austin, Texas for South by Southwest, and here online, though, with CircleCI's Rob Zuber and Sentry.io's Ben Vinegar to discuss this all-important topic, when to choose open source services. Hey, guys, how are you?
Hey, doing good, Alex.
Yeah, doing
Awesome. So part of the premise for this discussion is, when you start looking at developers' laptops, you see their stickers, you see what tools they're using, what languages and frameworks they like best. Developers do take pride in their choice of services, and making the decisions, though, can be a bit complicated. It's not always easy. And, these are choices that are worth a lot, right? They can be costly if the wrong decisions are made. They can slow you down. So in this fast-moving world of developer tools, how do you know really what you pick today and what will be there tomorrow? And that's really the premise for the discussion today. And so I'd love to hear just from each of you about those choices that you've made, about the software that you use, and starting with an open source approach or even a proprietary approach, and then what are the decisions then you've made from from there? Why don't we start with you, Rob?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So it's a really interesting way to frame it. I think when you look at the tools that we use, you're absolutely right. We put real energy into making decisions because making poor decisions can be really costly, or making maybe not poor decisions, but decisions that don't last because the technology doesn't keep up. And I would probably put those into a few different buckets in terms of the kinds of decisions that we have to make. So, for example, when we're building our own product, we use libraries and tools that are sort of deeply embedded, and then we use third-party services as well. So an example of a third-party service might be something like Datadog, where we collect all of our data, but don't actually care per se how their infrastructure is built or what technologies they've tooled to build it, as long as from the outside we can see the results that we need and there's a clear interface to interact with it. And I would separate that from technology that we choose to use inside our own product. For example, we've talked a lot recently in our own writing about Nomad, which is an open source scheduler that we use inside of our product to manage build fleet, right? And in that case, it's much more tightly integrated. It's much more sort of part of our product in the end. And so we need to be really comfortable and probably have a longer term vision, because we are then going to be supporting our customers with that. Whereas, an external service might be easier to kind of move on and off of, or have kind of a simpler interaction with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I believe it does. I think what you said about Datadog, for example, and kind of what the choice you make there, and what you have to be thinking about, though, when you're using a service like Datadog, is probably starting to become pretty standard, right? You can use the API, right? But when you're comparing that then to tools you're using internally, like Nomad, that becomes a different matter of kind of decision making about your own architecture. So, Ben, does that? I'm curious on your corollary on this context.
I think that decision-making process is probably very similar for most companies. I think you could say certainly there's in the case of Datadog, there are open source service products that you could run yourself that might be maybe not similar, but might touch some of what Datadog offers, and you could choose to run that yourself. But we're Datadog customers as well, and I think that part of the reason we do that is I think in 2018, I think software companies have taken a much harder look at the costs of supporting a lot of these internal tools. And, I think that we weigh much more how much value we get by having somebody, host and maintain and build a product externally versus having to do it ourselves. So, we're an open source company. That doesn't mean that we exclusively use open source tools that we host and run ourselves. We use the best product or the best tool for the job, and we weigh all of these different things together. How hard is it to maintain? What is the future of this product looking forward? How much money is it going to cost us to sort of support it? And when you do those evaluations, sometimes you go with an open source solution because it just hits all the right check marks for you, and sometimes you choose a commercial sort of like supported solution.
Okay, I just want to ask you a quick question then. What have you chosen? When have you chosen to go open source, and when have you chosen not to? What are some examples?
Let's see. What are some that we've chosen to do open source? So right now, I think that we're one thing I always have to highlight is that I'm more of a sort of like product focused engineering manager. I think that we're doing, we're hosting our own logging platform right now, but I don't think that that's even sort of like necessary. Like perhaps we would choose something differently in the future. It's just sort of that's a bit of inertia because that was something we chose a few years ago and haven't decided to move off of it. Actually, for a company like ours, we use a lot of commercial external services, like a ton. In some cases, that's the majority of what we use. Because we're a small company too, and I think that's a big factor in what we're trying to do. Like we don't have a ton of people to just sort of support all these tools. We want services and products to help do that for us. I mean, I could rip through some of those if you'd like.
Oh no, I mean, I'm just trying to understand. You both are making core architecture decisions, right? You guys are both making decisions about how you choose to build out value in your architecture. Right. And so perhaps focusing on that core architecture, Rob, these decisions that you guys have made over the years, and what have been the impacts of those decisions?
Yeah, well, I think I'll use Nomad again as an example. We're big fans and friends of HashiCorp. And so just as an example, we actually built our own scheduler in our original version of our product, right? It was 2011. There weren't a lot of options out there. Not a lot of people were spending their time and energy on schedulers, and we thought we had a very specific need. And in 2015, we sat down to really reevaluate how the core of our platform was built, which is how we bring in jobs and put them on the platform and find capacity to execute them, et cetera. And we realized, and this goes a little bit to the previous point, just what we should be spending our time and energy on. I mean, that's always the question, right? Is where do I truly differentiate as a business? And then what am I doing that is just supporting work to make my business function? And arguably taking jobs and putting them on our platform is a big part of what we do, but that specific piece of it is A, well understood now, and B, there are groups of engineers that spend all of their time and energy on that very subset of the problem, and it's a hard problem. So just being able to take that work and allow us to focus on the things that really matter, like how your tests run, how you structure that kind of information and talk to our platform, is much more valuable than us investing in job scheduling. On the other hand, these technologies aren't so baked that we'd be really confident in something that was perfectly shrink wrap, let's say, especially so core inside our architecture, as you said. And so we've issued patches against Nomad specifically because there are parts of our use case that aren't the exact set of use cases that they're modeling for. And so having that sort of flexibility as well as the relationship to say, hey, I know this isn't exactly what you were thinking about, but this is a real problem for us. Here's some feedback. Here's a way of implementing that, whatever, has been a really great model for us in building that out. So
before we go any further into the discussion, why don't each of you explain, the respective companies that you work with? Ben, why don't you start with Sentry and tell us a little bit about Sentry?
Yeah, so Sentry is a monitoring and software development tool that helps software teams move faster by letting them know about production errors, giving them sort of rich contextual information about issues when you deploy software to production, something goes wrong. What is the stack trace? What were the series of events that a user or your software took before a bug or an exception occurred? We sort of use this as a tool that we provide to software teams so that they can sort of understand what's broken in production and resolve things very quickly. We're an open source company. What that means is that you can go to GitHub and effectively run Sentry yourself. But primarily our business is that we run it as sort of a hosted commercial product. You can go sign up on Sentry.io.
Rob, tell us about CircleCI.
Yeah, for sure. So we're just a little bit upstream, I think, in the overall delivery process from Sentry. So CircleCI is focused on continuous integration and then continuous delivery and deployment. So we help software teams. We're also in the business of helping software teams get their products into market or into production, however you want to think about it, more quickly. And we are focused on giving you that confidence through continuous integration, basically executing all of your automated testing on every branch commit, as well as on merges to master or your default. And then when those things look good, helping the process or getting through the process of getting that into the production environment. And so really, again, helping teams take the software that they're working on every day and getting that in front of their customers earlier for faster feedback. I always think of Sentry as the exact next step, which is the safety net, right? So for those things that I didn't think about in my testing, the confidence to put them into production, because if something does go wrong, then I'm going to know about it, right? So the two are really tightly integrated as sort of steps in the overall delivery pipeline in my mind.
Okay. And when did CircleCI start? What year was that again?
Late 2011 with a release in early 2012.
And Sentry? When did it start?
So Sentry began as an open source project, and the very first commit was dating all the way back to 2008.
Oh, okay.
Began as effectively just an error aggregation tool for the Django application framework.
Okay.
It sort of grew organically as a business, where the sort of co-creators of the project sort of founded a part-time business.
Mm-hmm.
People basically didn't want to run the software themselves, and they approached the creators and said, hey, can we just pay you to do this? They ran that for a few years part-time, and then we sort of ramped up really as a business around 2015.
Okay. So Rob, tell me then a little bit, tracing your history back, what were some of the origination, some of the originations for the technology itself under CircleCI's platform?
Yeah, so to be clear, I was not here in 2011, 2012,
right.
When the company was starting. So I joined the company through the acquisition of an iOS CI platform that I had built with a couple other folks in the middle of 2014. So there's kind of two converging threads there. The creation of that platform was really a recognition that iOS specifically wasn't being served in this market. We knew about CircleCI and others in the space, but saw that iOS, we were actually working on iOS apps at the time, and just felt that the tooling was really poor. And so saw this gap, but quickly realized that iOS standalone is not really a thing. Everyone has a backend platform that they're trying to talk to. And so sort of joined forces with CircleCI. That was, again, 2014. As far as the origination of CircleCI, again, obvious gap in the market. So if you think about 2011, and it's so funny because it feels like yesterday, but it was actually a pretty long time ago from a technology evolution perspective. Every startup was building a Rails monolith, and unless they were building in Django, I guess, which is actually what I was doing just before 2011. But the ones that were really focused on testing, the whole kind of TDD world was really evolving. People were getting really behind that. Rails as a framework was getting a lot of traction, and it was very clear and obvious how to do testing in that world. A lot of people were thinking about automated testing at that time as really an innovative way to do this. And then coming up against the wall of, I need to go and run this thing. Either I write my own build script, which everyone thinks is simple, and then they only get so far, and they think, okay, well, this doesn't support all my cases. So they would, try to deploy something, and then realize this is not what I want to be doing. I'm a 3-person company, a 4-person company. I'm not going to spend my time managing a build system. And so Circle, that was recognized by the founders of Circle. Honestly, the minute they put the product into market, there was just this really quick pile on of customers who just thought, this is amazing. I don't want to have to manage this stuff myself. Similar to what Ben was talking about with the Sentry story of, yes, I want this solution, but I don't want to do it myself because I'm a small shop and I just have other things to focus on.
So did CircleCI launch as a software as a service?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So CircleCI was SaaS first in 2015, late 2015. We started offering a on-prem version of the product, but that's a very specific set of cases where that's the right solution for folks. for the most part, our continued growth in SaaS has shown that people would rather focus on other things and they just want a solution that works for them.
Okay, so both of you have companies that are using multiple services now. And your histories are a bit different. Ben, the company started as an open source project, right? And has its roots in Django. CircleCI was seemingly, sounds like it was a Ruby shop in its earliest days. And it evolved into a software as a service initially. So I'm curious, when did CircleCI, I think, start to think more about what open source architectures develop, or I imagine they probably were using them from the start and building out their platform and architecture.
Yeah, I mean, so to be clear, actually, there's a very brief flash in history where there was some actual Ruby written to build CircleCI, but I would say the customer base was very Ruby focused. We're actually a closure shop.
Okay, that's right, right.
And absolutely, I mean, from day one, I need to build a web server. I need an HTTP stack. I'm not going to write one from scratch, right? I'm going to take one off the shelf. For people who aren't familiar with Clojure, it does run on the JVM and has access to the whole Java ecosystem. So if someone hasn't written something in Clojure, we can take something from the Java world as well, which is pretty rich at this point. And so, large parts of our tooling are built using everything down to open source libraries. And then we talked previously about open source services and applications. Right. So we use open source databases. We use things like Nomad for scheduling. So we absolutely have made a lot of use of open source tools. And on the flip side, where we have done things like, there's a Java solution to this problem, we'll write a Clojure wrapper. We put those out, things that aren't our application, but that we've developed to solve our own problems. We put those back into the community. Clojure is interesting in that regard because, especially in 2011, it was a pretty nascent technology and community. And as a result, there wasn't always an open source solution to the problem. And so we've done our best along the way to, when we solve one of those problems, at least take that piece and put it back out in the community for others to use. That's obviously changed over the course of the last 7 years. It really has gained some traction, but it's still not the scale of, Python or Ruby or something like that in terms of the size of the community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how would you say that your trajectory has affected the overall organization, starting as an open source project and going to offering a software as a service environment? I'm curious about that. It's almost, you're starting out, you're managing a core and then building new features off of the core. But maybe you can tell me better, like how it's affected the trajectory of, development of Sentry.
So so the interesting thing is that Sentry is not open core, right? Where open core, if you're not familiar with it, is this idea of sort of like providing an open source foundation that is free to use, and it's usually feature limited. And if you want to sort of like pay more to the company that provides it, then you sort of get the like closed source sort of like, goodies on top of that. Right. So Sentry is, 99% open source. Right now, in terms of the product, the only closed source stuff that we do is our marketing and our billing, our subscription stuff, like the kind of stuff that lets us run the business on top of the software. So through that lens, like I think that, that obviously shapes like the culture and the DNA of our company, where we just build almost everything out in the open. We support open source projects, not just in terms of contributions, but also financially. So we support a number of projects through Open Collective or directly to, let's say, like the Django Foundation. So we sort of see ourselves as as a real open source company. We want to contribute financially, as well as just sort of like providing patches and sort of upstream help when we can. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It's really actually quite. So the model is based upon the services on top that you offer.
Yeah, in some ways you could think of us like Circle, like as an infrastructure company, right? Like anyone can, to get away from Circle, but like you can run the software yourself. But really like, and that's valuable. But part of the true value that we're offering is that managing event and error collection at scale is really complicated, and it's a big pain. And we want to take that pain away. And that's really, in terms of like the commercial offering that we provide on top of the open source offering, is to just sort of take all of that away from you. From Circle's perspective, I don't want to speak too much for Rob, but I don't want to have to, figure out how to spin up, just clusters of machines to run my CI tasks, right? Anyone can write shell scripts, right? And that's what we, a decade ago, certainly at older startups, we just had, elaborate scripts that we, ran, I think even on just dedicated machines. I think back then we just literally had metal machines that was the CI server that was available. And they've abstracted all that away.
How does that point in comparison to CircleCI? It's
in terms of.
I'm asking Rob. I was asking Rob how that. What's the context and comparison for you? Whereas we're talking here with Ben about an open source project and offering services on top, and your model, compares to more of a software as a service.
Absolutely. I mean, from a business model perspective, I think that customers come to us for the same reason, which is as the SaaS Sentry offering, right? Which we've talked about a little bit already. Just yes, I could do something simple, but this gets complex quickly. And whether it's, I totally agree with Ben's point. I mean, yes, I can download and install Sentry, but it's not going to be long before I'm running out of disk space, or it's not performing fast enough. And then I'm starting to invest time and energy in architecting a system versus just running a piece of software. And it's the same complexity in building, right? Scaling your workload. Like you could buy a dedicated server and leave it sitting there. And the budget for one server is probably fine, but when you have 50 engineers on your team and they only work during the core hours of one time zone, then you're losing a lot of value in that, just in the hardware, let alone in the time and energy that it's spent sort of managing it and managing the software around it, et cetera, right? So it's really, again, this focus on what is my core business, and is this a thing that I want to be doing, right? And it doesn't take very long for most people to realize that the complexity and investment is much higher than the return on that when there are other options out there, like having someone run it for you. And I think that's the core of both of our businesses, probably.
Mm-hmm.
So for the developers out there, they're always looking for new things. They're always trying to find new ways that they can solve problems and stuff. Does this question even come to their mind about open source, or they just expect there to be open source? They expect to be able to use code in a very free manner, and if so, does that affect how you approach the business, how you approach your development at all?
So I think in terms of developers want to define new tools, new ways of solving problems. I definitely think open source has an advantage here. Especially in large companies, sometimes this is sort of like a weird way of answering it, but sometimes the burden to experimenting with commercial software in a high bureaucracy environment can be really high. And so I think that sometimes when people are looking for sort of like new things to add to their tool set, like it can be sort of like, hey, I can skip procurement entirely. I don't have to go find my boss's Amex. I can just sort of play around with this tool on its own. Right. So that's one sort of interesting, compelling piece of open source that I think is sometimes overlooked. But at the same time, at least for me, I'm just as excited, yes, open source tools, that's cool. I'm interested in those too, but I'm also just as excited about commercial tools if they solve the problem, or like they accelerate the way that I can do my core competency, which Robert highlighted, which for me is to develop a really compelling piece of software. And so, they both offer different things, but I think that, or sort of like they come from different places, but I think ultimately that they're offering similar things in terms of what I'm looking for. Does that answer your question at all?
Well, let's see if Rob can add to it. I think that speaks to a lot of things, but Rob, any thoughts?
I think that's a great point, which is in many organizations, I mean, once you get beyond a pretty small number of developers and sort of the engineer, or sorry, your engineering team grows, your organization grows, the ability to try new things, I'll just say it changes, right? Much to Ben's point, it becomes harder, especially for better in many cases, but you have financial controls, security controls, many reasons. And I definitely think open source, or like my ability to just download something and try it out, is a factor in that. It's also one of the reasons that I think SaaS does so well in any model, right? And so just, it's not that I want to download this thing because I want access to the source, right? In the open source model, it's just that I can easily download it and there's instructions and I can just run it and see what it looks like. Most SaaS services, ours included, I don't know about Sentry, have some kind of trial offering, right? Where you can, I mean, we sort of offer you a limited scope for life that you can try out on our hosted platform. And I think you'll find that in most services. So you get the same kind of ability, just with a different solution. But I think if you didn't have that, you would have a much higher gate to getting people to sign up and try the product. If, for example, I can't get stuff expensed, I need to go get the corporate credit card, I need to write some justification or business case for why I'm going to spend this $50 a month or something, that kind of overhead makes it really hard for developers to just try new things. And I think you're absolutely right. Even if we have no plan to use them, we like to understand what's happening out in the market, just so we aren't blindsided by a significant change. And the easiest way to do that is to get our hands on stuff, right? To just tinker with it a little bit and get a feel for it. And that's pretty hard when there's some, procurement gate to try to get there.
So there's some threads here that I think come back to decision making, right? And how you're deciding what tools to use and what services to use and how you choose between them, and you're looking for optimization, right? I'm curious, there's going to always be kind of debate about what tools to use. There's always going to be a debate about what, platforms you're going to build. I'm curious about how values start to play into this. What are those kind of decisions you're making at a values-based level to dictate, to help you understand kind of, your own technology architecture and its trajectory. And there's, and those engineering decisions you make will deeply affect the product. So we're interested a lot in kind of how values affect kind of those engineering decisions, and does open source or proprietary software make a difference in how you make your choices at all? Or is it just really what works best for the product?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I'm struggling to come up with a really great answer, so I apologize for that. But I think from a values perspective, one thing, I don't think we have values that we would state around choosing open source versus not or whatever. We do have values around optimizing for our own customers and the value of the business. Like we set out with an objective that's going to be driven by the needs of the business, either creating functionality for customers or managing cost, making our operations simpler so that we can reduce overhead for our own teams, whatever it might be that's going to create some business value. And then we would use that to make decisions about the right technology. And we definitely, as we've said a little bit, we look at things through the lens of is this really core to our business, or is this supporting? And if it's supporting, then we should be looking at kind of the simplest solution, and often the one that we can get from somebody else. If it's core to our business and the thing on which we're really trying to differentiate, then that's where we want to be investing our time and energy. But even then, again, use the HTTP stack as an example. I mean, our website is arguably core to our business, but the technology behind a website is not something we're going to spend our time and energy building. We're going to build the actual expression of that to the customer, the expression of our business. So one thing that keeps coming into my mind is I have not had a discussion in the last 6+ years about using a library that wasn't open source, right? Maybe 15 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe we would have said, here's a really valuable library.
PDF generation.
Yeah, sure. I'm pretty sure that's been done at this point many times over. But yeah, like something like that, maybe. I think we used to license encryption libraries, but even those, there's great solutions in many languages at this point. So that, like when you're building your core stack, the notion that I'm going to go purchase a library that does something really well just doesn't feel like a conversation that comes up anymore. Very different in how I'm going to manage my system, right? I mean, we're probably all deploying in some form of public cloud. So even, some pretty low level stuff we're just giving to other people, monitoring for exceptions, collecting data, things that are fundamental to our business, but not core differentiators of our business. We're purchasing as a commercial entity, independent of whether it's built on open source software or not. But how we construct our own code has really come down to the stuff we write plus a large base of open source software.
Ben, I'm curious from your perspective. I mean, the values that affect open source communities are becoming more and more a topic that is being addressed. And I'm just curious in your thoughts on the values, kind of, and how you think about values in terms of your own business, your engineering teams, and how it intersects with open source ecosystems.
So yeah, I think in terms of values, like obviously as an open source company, I think that we definitely, let's say, explore a little deeper what open source solutions are available to us. And I think that, like I mentioned, like we, contribute financially to open source projects, and similarly, like if we can use open source software in a way that makes sense for our business, we'll try hard to do that. But we're never gonna choose an inferior solution. Just to sort of like check a box that this is an open source tool. I will touch on, one part that impacts our business that is, I think, I don't know if that's values based, but I think it speaks more to just the origin of the business as an open source company, which is that we, in terms of, libraries and services, like I think that we use we're a little more constrained in which services we can use, because we are still offering an open source product that you can clone off GitHub, or you can run on Docker and run it yourself. And that's sort of like, let me give you an example. Like we run our services on Google Cloud today. And Google Cloud, much like Amazon, has a whole bunch of really cool, infrastructure tools that you could deploy as part of your offering. Like, let's say BigQuery. Maybe we could offer BigQuery on, stack traces to do some sort of elaborate mining of errors. But the tricky thing about that is that, well, how can we ship that down to a user at the open source level, right? How can they run this on their own services if they're not on Google Cloud, right? This has to run everywhere, right? So a lot of the choices that we make are sort of like, we use a lot of commodity open source services because we have to make it easy for people to run and sort of not provide constraints that would sort of hinder their ability to run the software themselves. Does that sort of make sense?
Totally makes sense. And it gets to my follow-up questions about the cloud services, and I'm curious on decisions you're making about cloud services. And Ben, you point a little bit to that. Rob, what are your cloud services you use?
Yeah, so we run a split actually of AWS and GCP. So we run both. Primarily, we sort of grew up on AWS, so that's where most of our stuff is. But we actually have the same problem in a different light that Ben's describing, because we have what we call our server install option. You can take our product and run it on your own system, which may or may not be AWS or GCP or something else. And as a result, we also don't use those higher level offerings, like in AWS would be Dynamo or SQS or things like that, because we don't have disconnected versions of those that we can then use in an install. So similarly, we'll use RDS, which is Postgres managed for us within AWS, because we can always install Postgres and have API compatibility with a different configuration in another location. But we similarly don't use things like Bigtable. We do, for our own purposes, our own internal analytics and things like that, use some of those tools, because those aren't things that are part of the package that we provide to others. And I think Ben was similarly separating that, like the services that we layer on top to offer this as a SaaS offering, some of those are, we can do whatever we want because they're not part of the product that we sell. But the product that we sell in terms of what you can take and run includes a pretty big scope of our operations. And therefore we have to think about that, with our own internal teams. And this is interesting, going from SaaS to standalone versus the other way was, we have a lot of tricks and tools that we use that weren't designed initially to be in the hands of the customer. And so now we have to disconnect from some of these higher level systems, build tooling that's really appropriate to give to our customers as they operate this system. I would imagine in the Sentry case, but I'd be interested to hear also, some of that stuff was built with that in mind, because that's how it was, distributed initially, and then was just used as moving into the cloud environment.
Yeah, I think that our approach is very similar. Like we use some of those, say higher level kind of like, cloud offerings in support of the business. Like I know, for example, I know that we use cloud functions on our sort of like operations SRE teams to sort of like, help push data around, push logs around as an example. But we would never, rely on cloud functions or Lambda as a part of the core product, right?
So it relates to me questions about the cloud services that, you use these and you're paying them, or you're working with credits, however it is. But they're getting your business. And what's the trust? What's the trust implicit with them that you expect in terms of, what they offer and how they believe in open source and how they believe about proprietary software?
That's a great question. I feel like Ben was about to say something, so I'm gonna wait a second.
No, go ahead.
I think it's, there's so many ways to express this. I mean, definitely those platforms, if you look at the kinds of things that we do, I think for both of us, we're in the same space that those platforms are expanding into, right? Meaning around the actual pipeline of getting software into a production environment, around tooling for developers in general. I mean, it's a little abstract, but you could say we're definitely on the boundary. And so I wouldn't say it's flat out trust. Like, obviously they will never be interested in my business, and therefore I'm going to ignore it and not worry about it, but rather just motivation for us to be.
It's trust I'm thinking specifically trust in a platform, right?
I see. Well,
I mean, but you're speaking about trust overall. I am speaking about trust overall, and there are many ways to look at it. But they are an architect. They do represent their own architectures, and they have their own thoughts on how to optimize those architectures, right? They're always looking for greater efficiencies, and those efficiencies they often find new products and services, right, that they can offer.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So to finish that thread, I would just say we're motivated to be, we're very narrowly focused and very motivated to be very, very good at the thing that we offer.
Right.
Sort of this philosophy, if you will, of do one thing and do it very well.
Right.
And so that will, we're comfortable in that. In terms of the trust of the underlying system, I mean, I think this actually comes into play when you talk about any kind of SaaS offering, right? It's easy to say, oh, I could just do that. Like I could go, maybe this is what you're getting at, go build a data center and just run all this myself. But that's also not super core to what we want to do, right? And there's a lot of complexity in there that, being able to leverage those platforms allows us to focus again on the things that really differentiate us.
Well, I get you, and I guess it comes down like trade-offs that you have to make as well, and like then that affects kind of the relationship with the cloud service. For instance, you may not want to use their database for obvious reasons, right? You may want to use a Postgres or something.
I see. So you're talking about sort of like when we're talking about like database as a service, or they're more like, you could argue that they are sort of like they have commercial, in some ways, closed source sort of
which affects your relationship with them, right? And so there's these different expectations you have across kind of the spectrum of this application architecture development, such as choices about databases, right?
Yeah, I think that for starters, without getting like too deep into this, but in some ways there is a bit of a sort of a like, platform API that's developed. Like a lot of Google's offerings are like one-to-one API equivalent with Amazon's as an example. So, do you feel super locked into using Google's cloud functions when AWS Lambda exists, and Azure, I'm sure, has something or will have something too? Like, no, not really. At least for a lot of these things. I think you're right that and this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about us, like, we already have to focus on sort of like, commodity open source for the gross majority of what we do. I would agree that it'd be sort of, we'd have to take a really big, risk analysis about changing onto sort of like a more, Google or Amazon sort of like managed service that's more opaque and we don't understand as well, right? But at this point, we haven't really done that. So does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious at how. Yeah, okay, go ahead, Rob. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think that's a really fascinating subject. In that, I heard an interesting talk at a conference recently where someone was suggesting embracing vendor lock-in, and so we're talking about a model that's true for both of us, where you need to be able to take our product and execute it in a different environment because we're not a pure SaaS play, but many companies will always be a pure SaaS play, and if you're in that world, that is a really interesting trade-off decision to make. Do I use Bigtable or Dynamo or something like that? Because that is accelerating my ability to deliver my core business, but it introduces this risk that, that cloud provider seems unlikely that they're going to deprecate those things, but they change it in a way that no longer really manages what I want or works in the way that I require. But all of these things are accelerators, right?
It's probably worth even touching on that, some open, just as you can be locked into sort of into a commercial offering, you can be locked into an open source offering too, right? It's not a completely separate idea. You can be locked into an open source project that could wrap up and go nowhere. You could be locked into a closed source offering or a commercial offering that can wrap up and cease business. Like the risks they're everywhere. They're not exclusive to sort of like, one commercial closed source or open source offering.
Yeah, for sure. Then what's the importance of multi-cloud architectures? Like, what's the importance of Kubernetes? Kubernetes runs on primitives like Linux, kernel did at a lower level. Now you're building, these primitives at a higher level. I mean, what's the impact of that? Does that help? Does that play any kind of factor in how we're going to view cloud services and how, and how architecture is going to be built for developers? Because the container architectures obviously have an advantage, right? You're not going to just depart with virtualization.
Well, I mean, if you were to think of, in the context of this discussion, the way that I would describe Kubernetes and container architectures is really just an abstraction, right? And so it's not that you're consciously thinking about multi-cloud, but in all of our software designs, ideally, we're abstracting out those, dependencies. And if it's like a Dynamo versus Bigtable, I can at least squish down all of my understanding of the fact that I'm using that data store into a particular area of my software so that it's not, lock-in is never lock-in. It's just the amount of effort required to get out. And I can minimize that effort through good software design. And at a higher level in systems, building a Docker image that I'm going to use on Kubernetes is an abstraction away from any understanding of the specific cloud that I've deployed in. It may not even be a cloud, right? To your point, I can run Kubernetes on bare metal. I can run it. I don't even have to run it now in most of the cloud providers. They'll run it for me because they have these higher level services. But if I'm assuming that's how my software is going to run, then until all of Docker and Kubernetes collapses and we've moved on to some new thing, I am isolated from my decisions about, the cloud environment in which I'm going to run. So Ben? 4 years ago, sorry, just to finish that thought, 4 years ago, we would have baked an AMI, right, or a machine image for Google, and that I would have built tooling to do that, and that would be very specific. And now I'm going to use a Docker image, which I can deploy anywhere.
I have nothing to add. So
I'm just curious about kind of the multiple architecture story, kind of as it relates to open source. And I think probably for more developers who you guys talk to, think, as far as they're going to go is thinking about, I don't know, how far do they go? Is it as much as just knowing that they're going to be using server-side, architectures and, thinking about JavaScript, server-side JavaScript with Node.js? I mean, what are the priorities that they're putting on? I mean, but what priorities do they have that does affect kind of this whole kind of thinking about using different architectures, using multiple cloud servers, or does this not really matter?
I don't know if this exactly answers it, but just sort of I think it's very related, which is, we look to what our customers are asking for and what they're using, and this, impacts what we want to deliver to users in terms of like what environments are they deploying to. Like, for example, a year and a half ago, we decided to distribute Sentry, like the open source Sentry sort of like platform, run it yourself on Docker, right? And that was a decision. We don't want to support every single sort of platform like that, but we felt like that had become in some ways like enough of an industry standard, and it would be easier for people rather than say cloning and building the entire thing from source, right? And certainly, like if other technologies emerge and that feels like that's the way that we're going, we'll make it easy for people that way too. So I don't know if this sort of answers it all.
Yeah. Well, I think it gets back, to kind of one of the questions we were initially at the beginning of the conversation, and perhaps we can, finish up and just thinking a little bit about discussing, how developers, what developers are facing. They're facing, this really fast-moving world of developer tools, and so how do they know what they're going to pick today actually will be there tomorrow? How do you guys go about decision-making processes that, that you've either, that you found have worked, or maybe turns out not to really be functional kind of in what you're trying to achieve? And because there's always going to be trade-offs. I'm just curious about that process. So what you are finding, what you pick today, if what you pick today will be there tomorrow.
So I find this topic really fascinating, and I think as engineering leaders and ladders, I don't know, is pretty crucial, right? Like these are technology decisions like this can really impact your business and your engineering organization for years. I think that culturally we tend to be a little conservative. Like Sentry tends to be a little conservative in terms of what we choose. Like we don't necessarily go for what is the bleeding edge. We want to see sort of like technology sort of like gather enough mind share, make sure there's enough material out there. We want to see other sort of like users and businesses in our space like adopt something, right? We don't want to be the sort of like bellwether people bringing a torch about a new technology, if that makes sense. When it comes to sort of like choosing open source, so that's the same for commercial software or open source software, right? Like let's say like React version, alpha 0.5, like we're not going to be there. We're going to wait till maybe it hits 1.0 and we feel like this is like really kind of like growing a lot of mind share. And that's what we did when we adopted React like a year and a half ago. So
you're gauging the strength of the community, you're gauging the value of the platform. You're looking at those from a lens that says, well, this looks at its face value, looks okay, but let's see how it develops before we make any kind of commitment to it.
Yeah. And so just really quickly I want to touch like, when it comes to commercial products, like I'm sure I'll let Rob jump on this as well too, but like, we're looking at what is the team behind the company? What is the funding situation? Who are their customers? Who else in this space is using this product? But that's the same for open source as well too. Mm-hmm. I'm previously like a front engineer, like sort of like when React sort of came out, like who's using this? It took a while before it actually felt like people, like real businesses were using this in production, which gave me confidence that we could also do this too. Comes to an open source project, what is the open source team? What is the level of contribution look like? Like we'll take a look at the commits. What does the documentation look like? Does this have, let's say that, does this project have a bus factor of 1? And what happens when that person gets burnt out? Like, is there sort of a line of succession for somebody to kind of like help and contribute? Rob, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I think we made that joke previously in some other conversation about the fact that whenever you evaluate, just in the very small, here's a library that solves our problem or seems to solve our problem. The first thing you do is go to GitHub or wherever and look at the commits And if it's been more than 6 months since anyone pushed anything to it, you have this conversation, which is, are they done? Like, is it just perfect and there's nothing to ever add, or have they walked away and we're never going to be able to fix any issues that come up in this project? Right? So that's a real evaluation. That's on the very small. In terms of the large, I absolutely agree. As you change, as the course of, or the life cycle of your company changes, kind of the risk in these investments changes as well. And so really looking at what is the adoption level, where is this going, is a key part. I'm trying to think of an interesting example for us, and we've talked publicly about this. I mean, our initial product was built entirely on top of Mongo. And I would say at the time, Mongo had pretty high adoption. A lot of developers were using it. What it didn't have was, and so the time, quote unquote, would be 2011, 2012. What it didn't have was a lot of large scale production experience. And there were a lot of lessons learned by not only us, but the community of Mongo users over time. Because that was an early decision, we are still pretty tied to it. We have other systems now, as we break out services using Postgres.
If I could jump in for a moment, yeah. I think a really important thing is being able to separate, what is the thought leadership, blog post, Twitter reaction around a technology versus the real world implications. And I think trying to separate those and understand them can be difficult. Is this what you're touching on?
Yeah, exactly. And in this particular case, I think the adoption was very fast because it was very easy for developers. And developers often make these choices at low scale, especially when you're talking about startups. And then it's often someone else's problem at high scale. The team has grown and someone else is there to sort of clean up the operational situation. I mean, Mongo has matured a lot in that time frame. That's how I was going to finish. We still use it. It's a much better database now than it was then. But the other question that I would have asked then would be, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Sometimes we're excited about new technologies that don't necessarily solve a real existing problem that we're suffering from, but we try them out because they're new. And so that's a very different scenario from, this is a new technology solving a problem we have not been able to solve previously. You talked about React. Yes, we've been able to build web pages in the past, but the mental model of delivering, robust event-driven UIs, I think really shifted with React. And so that was something that you're assessing, not because it's new, it's the new thing. I mean, that's part of it, but also because it actually seems to fundamentally change the way we build things. And that is interesting and exciting to us. That's a place that I would put Docker as well. And just how we manage things operationally has fundamentally shifted. We should put some real weight into evaluating this technology.
Absolutely. One thing I want to touch on here, and this is just sort of, because I have to get a pro open source, even though I think I've been pretty even-handed for the most of this, I do want to offer a pro open source bent to this in terms of how to choose software. Because one compelling thing about open source software that can be tough with commercial services is like Rob touched on, which is well, you can look at the code, you can see who the contributors are, and you can see what, maybe what the package downloads are, or what does this feel like, where is this going? And what does maybe even the long-term prospects of this technology look like? A tricky thing with closed source software is that it becomes kind of opaque, right? You have to put a lot of trust in the logos that you see on the web page in terms of customers, or sort of what you've heard in the industry from your friends or your peers, but you don't necessarily, you're not privy to what takes place in the boardroom. You're not privy to what takes place in terms of that company's balance sheet, in terms of maybe a company just disappearing, or even strategically, there can be a shift that you never even expected. And I'll highlight something that was really unexpected for us a couple of years ago. We actually used MailChimp for email delivery for Sentry, because they had sort of I forget the exact, was it Mandrill? They had a sort of more, SendGrid kind of email delivery client. And then all of a sudden, they just decided they didn't want to be in this business anymore. They were just going to focus solely on sort of campaign emails. They flipped the billing model. And I think that they gave everybody something like 2 months. It felt like a very short cycle to actually sort of before this shifted over. And I'll highlight that can be a tricky thing that that, and not to say that open source software isn't immune from that. Like there could be like wild API changes could also occur, in a library or whatever. But it's an interesting, tricky part sometimes.
It's where this conversation actually could go a lot longer. We could talk a lot about the evaluation of the software itself, in those decisions that you make about APIs. I mean, the decisions about APIs and how they change has to play a big part in this. I mean, you guys have I'm sure have experiences you could talk to where it's, maybe what is like, maybe my last question, like, what's the dysfunctional API? What's have you ever met a dysfunctional API and how did it work out?
Well, I think the classic example would be Facebook.
That was like on the tip of my tongue.
I remember Zuck being on stage at the F8 developer conference saying, "Hey, look, we've been really bad, but now we're going to be good." They were like, move fast and break things, and move fast and break things included their platform API. I mean, every Tuesday you were just trying to figure out if you could still talk to Facebook.
But that's not really like a service that we've chosen to work with. It's sort of like you have to work with it.
Right, exactly. I mean, and so it was definitely challenging. And then they said, oh, but we're going to be better actors. And then of course they had just acquired Parse, if you remember that.
Yeah.
And then everyone got on that platform, and then they shut it down. And so it was like, well, how many times are we going to go through this motion before we all just find different businesses to be in where this doesn't have to be part of our ethos? I haven't worked with their platform in years, so I can't say anything recently, but certainly.
Well, again, it speaks to the ethics and the values that the API holder has to live by.
What I think it actually touches on, and I think this speaks to perhaps, going back to like Google and Amazon, which is like, specifically around Parse, which is when you chose, when companies chose to adopt Parse, which is like, you have to have some trust, again, like in the board or whatever's happening strategically with that business. And I think that perhaps there should be there should have been like a serious conversation of like, what did Facebook believe the long-term prospects of Parse were and its impact on its business, right? Turns out they didn't, really feel that way. And if you sort of adopted that platform, that sort of sucked, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that is something you have to think about a lot when adopting a platform or technology, right? Like, I think every indication we have from Google and, obviously Amazon is like, it's not good. It's not going anywhere, right?
Well, isn't this an important thinking then about the cloud services too? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
Like in how they treat APIs and what their values reflect. I mean, it's kind of tough if the company that you're depending on for data decides that they're going to change their API.
Absolutely, I think this is a place less open source or not, more like, as you said, company values, as well as just think about who is your customer, right? Like, Parse as a standalone company, CircleCI, Sentry, our customers are developers. We live and die by developers. And so acting in a way that's not developer friendly is insane, for lack of a better expression. Like, that would be ludicrous for us to make decisions that are not developer oriented. Parse, under the umbrella of Facebook with their own API, they have built a platform or a product offering that in and of itself is, I think, so much more valuable to them than the platform and ecosystem around it. That their behavior isn't necessarily driven, like their priorities in decision making are not going to be the same as our priorities in decision making. And so I can respect that, but as a developer trying to use that platform, that can be frustrating, right? And so just being eyes wide open on that, like, who am I making the decision to operate in conjunction with or partner with? And honestly, when you're a startup, it doesn't feel like you're partnering with Facebook. Let's be honest. They are a massive organization with huge sources of revenue that are not me. And so that kind of balance as well is just different in that moment.
Right. To speak to the open source side on this, I think that, a difference between Parse and, say, React is like, part of what added a lot of confidence for me, and I think for a lot of other people, is that Facebook has adopted React organization-wide, right? And so there's a signal there that they obviously are going to invest in that ecosystem in a really big way because they're fundamentally tied to it themselves, right? And they have, right? But were they building, how much of their software were they building on parse? I don't know. Does this sort of make sense?
Yeah, is it GraphQL that they also manage?
Yep. I'd feel similarly about that in terms of something that.
How do you feel about the management of GraphQL?
GraphQL is an interesting topic because I think GraphQL has reached the inflection point perhaps that React was at a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Where me as somebody who's choosing technology or whatever, I feel like it's hit perhaps like an inflection point in terms of adoption and sort of just where it's at, where I might feel way more comfortable about choosing to invest in it today. And I think that similar to like Rob touched on, like React perhaps changed the way that we looked at writing client-side web applications. I think that GraphQL offers a lot of just sort of like changing the paradigm for how we return and send data from the server, right? So it offers that sort of like big stepping stone as opposed to just sort of being just like a slight new fancy kind of thing.
One thing that's interesting about GraphQL specifically is that it's not necessarily the code or the implementation, right?
Yeah.
GraphQL is a concept, and so we use GraphQL. On the server side, we don't use any product that comes from Facebook. We use something that was built by Walmart Labs, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the client side, we do use React, but not in terms of content, like in terms of the conversation with GraphQL, that actual component also not from Facebook. So it's a little bit different in that it's more like an open idea than open source.
Absolutely.
And implement that spec, if you will, using any technology versus React itself. Like, I don't think anyone's going to sit down and rewrite React differently.
Well, in some ways it did, or like sort of the rendering model actually did get adopted by Ember and Angular, sort of like, right? So in some ways the idea did take hold in other libraries as well too, VUE as well.
This is a topic I would love to explore more with y'all. I'm here in Austin for South by Southwest. One of the themes that I'm picking up on are, starting to think more about kind of the community around different hubs. And, here there's a lot of talk about data, right? And the implications of data, right? And they're covered in all sorts of terms, blockchain and, cryptocurrency and AI and, virtual reality and augmented reality. There's more of that stuff here than you could ever imagine. Which you can, it's South by Southwest. But it speaks to, I think, larger questions about data and accessibility of data and the evolution of application architectures, kind of as another hub, and then this third hub really being the values around all these different topics. And so this API question is one that I think we could probably talk about quite a bit, because as you're starting to think about application architectures and how you start integrating more, more seamlessly or more, better architecturally with data environments, it's going to start to. I think then you start to then intersect that with questions about values and who's developing these technologies and how they're being used, and everything else is a conversation we could have, I think, over several episodes. But I really appreciate your time today to discuss these topics. I thought we covered a lot of ground, and I just would love to just have you guys just maybe end it with some of your final thoughts on this conversation and where we're thinking about going forward.
Let's see, final thoughts. I guess we had this title like open source versus closed source. Certainly we did not, reach any kind of definitive answer. Everything offers a little bit something different. I think that one, if I were to like, the biggest themes were just that focus on your business, focus on your core competencies, invest in the thing that lets you do the thing that's great for you. Rob, you want to
Yeah, I think
add on to this, pile
I
on?
totally agree. It's not really an or. It's ultimately about different decision-making points. And then the one other one that I think that we talked about that was interesting was just risk, like the alignment between the thing you're trying to do, between the values of your company and the provider of whatever technology you're choosing, something that you really need to spend some time thinking about.
Well, on that note, I'm going to conclude this webinar. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I've really enjoyed it, and I think there's lots of conversations that could come from several of the topics that we covered. So, to our future conversations, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, CircleCI. Thank you, Sentry, for making this event possible.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks,
It was
Alex.
really fun to chat.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, take care.
Thanks.